Today's episode of the Energy Newsbeat podcast is brought to you by Enverus. The energy industry faces massive challenges every day, and the events over the last 2 years have caused huge disruptions like never before. Companies in the energy industry need actionable intelligence and a single source of truth that brings all the data together. Enverus is the energy specialized technology partner that provides intelligent connections for a global energy ecosystem. Only Enverus has the analytics, people, experience, and industry scope to connect the right data and information in the right way to discover missed opportunities and deliver fast outcomes. Find out more at Enverus.com. That's ENVERUS.com.
Hello, everybody. Today is not only a fantastic day, it is really a fantastic day. We're going to have a really good discussion on a very important topic right now. And my name's Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group. And I got Kathrine Blunt here. And she is we were kind of laughing just before this, an authoress. And if that's a name, that's a name. But she has written the book, California Burning, and I highly recommend it. And you can tell I've been doing some notes on it here and everything else. Kathrine, thank you, and welcome to the Energy Newsbeat.
Thanks for having me.
I'll tell you, we're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to start out with a couple things. Your expertise and your background. You started at the Journal, and how did you get thrown into the energy segment?
Yeah, so I was hired specifically to cover renewables and utilities. I didn't have much experience in the utility space. I had some familiarity with energy and business reporting more broadly, but not utilities, which, as we know, are complicated beasts. And so I joined on November 5th, 2018, and the Camp Fire, a large fire that ignited in PG&E's service territory that year, happened 3 days later. And within a week or so, it became pretty clear that one of PG&E's power lines was going to be implicated in this fire.
Right.
So that sparked some very serious investigative work that I did with two close former colleagues. We ended up producing a number of articles that got some significant recognition that I'm very proud of. And it seemed like a good topic that was worth an even deeper dive. So here we are.
Well, as a reporter and everything else, your style for the book is not like a normal style. I mean, when I was reading this and getting ready for our interview, it's more like a novel, a very historic novel with this gigantic problem. That's pretty cool. I don't know the research that you did in here. How did you get some of the conversations? Because there's a lot of conversations. Yeah. You're rolling your eyes and curling up in the fetal position, so it must have been really bad.
Oh, I mean, it really was a monumental research effort, truly. I mean, there was a number of ways in which some of those conversations were captured. Some, of course, is people's recollections of what was said. And in some cases, there's some conversations that people had in 1912. That was from old newspaper articles. I scoured old newspaper clippings and how they were quoted at the time. Some of it is in court transcripts, legal filings. There was some regulatory filings. So all different kinds of sources here. I mean, it's a complicated story, but there's certainly no dearth of information through which to tell it.
Your blending of history and stories and boring court records, well done. But when we start out with the problems, you said you started right after the Camp Fire, but this problem started a bazillion years ago.
Yeah.
And so tell us how this problem started.
Yeah, I mean, so if you think about the history of PG&E, it's a long and storied history, and it's not all bad by any means. It was a really critical company to the development of California. It formed around the turn of the 20th century as some electric pioneers recognized the potential to capture the vast amounts of hydropower in Sierra Nevada, built transmission lines to carry hydroelectric power to the population centers, mostly San Francisco. And so it grew by way of acquisition of all these teeny tiny power companies that were cropping up to serve different parts of the state. It only had one real competitor historically. It was a company called Great Western Power. I really like the history of Great Western. Really a pioneering company, and their competition was pretty fierce and at times kind of funny. So they competed, pretty staunchly until they merged in 1930, creating the big Northern California monopoly that we know today. And with that came a lot of economic prosperity, helped
Right.
promote job growth, and electrified different parts of the state. Did so much to build the infrastructure that we are reliant on today,
Wow.
especially after World War II in particular. But with
Yeah.
that came a big challenge because that infrastructure is now very old. And the line that failed and ignited the campfire was actually original Great Western transmission line. It had
Was
been,
it really?
it was.
Now you talk in the book, and I want to double check and see if this is the right one. But you talked about the corrosion of the metal and the line that held it up, and then the covering up the story, and then having to go back in. So they actually tried to cover up accidents in the past, and it seems like the records couldn't be found. So if it's this old of a transmission line, there's been a history for a long time of bad record keeping and then trying to cover up accidents.
Yeah, I think the record keeping was certainly a problem when
Right.
prosecutors asked them to produce records specifically on the equipment that failed. They didn't have the records anymore. I mean, in part maybe because they got purged at some point in time or simply lost over
Right.
the course of 100 years. I mean, that's a long time to be keeping track of little pieces of paper.
Right.
And so it really didn't know exactly how old the transmission line was, or at least certain components of it. They made some educated guesses, but
Right.
couldn't pinpoint some of this stuff. It actually took FBI analysis to reveal that the hook that broke and dropped the wire was truly almost 100 years old, installed around 1919 or 1920.
Yep.
And so
So
the thing
I didn't misread your book then, did I?
No, no, you didn't. And in terms of the other the they were supposed to have done close inspections, like close tower inspections of lines that
Yep.
have been exhibiting a lot of problems.
Right.
And this particular transmission line had been exhibiting a lot of problems over the years, and yet they didn't prioritize it for the sort of treatment that might have been able to detect that
Right.
the erosion of that little piece of metal that broke.
And that caused all that fire there's a bunch of fires that have happened to them over the years, destroying millions of dollars and ruining lives.
Hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
major consequences. The failure had major consequences.
so this history of bad record keeping, lower maintenance, and we have a completely old grid right now.
Right.
Then you throw renewables onto this, which is a different, it's got physics. Physics are different with renewables because you have what do they call, the bridging authorities, or you have the different authorities trying to vie for power. And on this old equipment, how do we get the record? I mean, this was just a real problem. I'm
Hmm.
kind of lost for words on where we go from here with all the problems that you have in the book. I mean, it's like it's still a problem.
Yeah, so if you're talking about renewables in the PG&E context, um, it posed a specific challenge for sort of a specific reason. Around the time, so PG&E, as many listeners may remember, filed for bankruptcy around 2001, 2002 timeframe as a
Right,
result of the California energy crisis.
right,
When it emerged, that's when you see California really begin to set some ambitious renewable energy targets, and
right,
PG&E, as well as the other California utilities, have to go out and contract for a lot of wind and solar power.
right,
Wind and solar were much more expensive back then than they are now, and so these contracts were
right,
long-term contracts that are quite expensive. Those costs are passed on to consumers. So in trying to manage
right.
costs, it added a certain level of expense pressure, which is one of the reasons why you saw the company reducing inspection costs and other things. There's many
Uh,
reasons for it, but it
yeah.
did create some challenges for this company.
I'll tell you, because it seems like the consumer always gets to pay for everything.
Right.
So with the high cost of, there are three big areas of cost in the U.S. for electricity. There's two up in the eastern coast that are higher than California. I didn't realize that. I've always heard that California is the highest on that. But your research on looking at the dates, the times, the hours, and I love some of your quotes in here. PG&E's dysfunction weighed heavily on Michael Pickard. I mean, you even get into how people felt.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I mean,
um,
PG&E has been a big challenge for so many different people, you know?
um, and when you talk about, let me get to this one question here that I thought was really pretty groovy. Um, Before leaving office, Schwarzenegger had advanced the idea of requiring renewable energy to supply to 33% of the electricity sources by 2020. That new goal, I'm going down a little bit more, that new goal that each state utility would have to procure even more wind and solar than there was even able of doing. I mean, this has been a real issue for a long time.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple ways to look at the California experience on renewables. On
Uh-huh.
the one hand, the early investments made by developers who are contracting with the utilities, I mean, it's helped to
Right,
drive down the costs over time, created economies of
right,
scale, needed to deploy more renewables elsewhere in the country,
right,
but it didn't come cheap. I mean, they were expensive back in the day, much, much more
right,
expensive than they are now. So that's,
right,
and a concern of mine, you were talking about the challenge nationwide, is that let's just consider these early contracts fuel costs, right? There's
right,
not fuel, like, because wind and solar, they don't have fuel costs, but let's just call it
right.
fuel costs. You're seeing fuel costs
Uh,
rise
That's
with
a
the,
that's a good way to look at it.
yeah. And so now with natural gas prices being where they are, and those
Right,
costs being passed on to consumers, especially in regions that are so reliant on natural gas,
right,
that's that's increasing bills, and I think that's going to increase in expense pressures within other utilities. So that
right.
poses a big problem.
I'll tell you, I loved your Death March chapter, and there was some in here, and it was deregulation. And you talked about when they were deregulating things, the prices dropped. So, do you see if deregulation of solar and wind and the commissions can help consumers? I mean, I love the way you phrased it in here. Deregulating the electric business meant the utilities would, for the most part, no longer, and it would sell it. I mean, you had some really good quotes in here. First five states to deregulate the processes. Do you see that we could get money lower to the consumers by deregulating?
Yeah, it's a really tough question. So, I mean, obviously, we have seen deregulation to different degrees in different markets throughout the
Right,
United States. So, I think deregulation, I hate the name because it's like, it's not really precise. There's always going to be regulation of the utility business. There has to be.
and there should be, yes.
There should be. I mean, no matter what, you still have companies that have to maintain this infrastructure, and that needs to be
Right,
regulated to some degree because it's a critical service. Deregulation specifically was meant to create competition among power generators, right? So
oh, okay,
taking that function away from the utilities, taking their power plants away from them, essentially,
right,
removing that layer of vertical integration and giving it to competitive power producers who would compete to sell low cost electricity.
right,
The initial California experiment was, the market design was such that there were contingencies that really stressed it. You did not see lower costs during this particular period of time. Wholesale power
right,
prices became very high, ultimately drove PG&E into bankruptcy. The different experience was Texas. Texas deregulated around the same time and had the
okay,
most competitive power market in the country, in the
right,
sense that power producers are only paid for the electricity they produce, nothing more.
right,
And so they're not paid any sort of additional money to be available on standby in case there's some sort of emergency.
right,
So actually, that helped keep Texas power prices low for a very long time.
right.
But a real disaster happened in February of 2021
I
when
know.
Texas froze over.
Yeah,
Yeah.
everybody was getting $1,000 bills,
Yeah, I was
for,
living in Houston at the time. I experienced it. So,
oh my goodness.
and yeah, so covered it while living it. That was a lot of fun. And so, I think very legitimate criticism to make of the Texas market was that,
Right,
it was not prepared for a contingency of this sort because the power producers just really didn't expect it to happen. So why spend that
right,
money on the preparation, right?
right,
Then it happens, and the power is out for 4 days, and more than 200 people die.
right,
And so what is the cost of that? So it's hard to and then all of a sudden, everyone's looking at PJM, right, which is an
Right.
expensive power market because they are paid to operate on standby, and they're like, maybe
Right.
that's the model, So there's
Right.
trade-offs. There's costs and benefits of everything.
Yep. And so but you take a look at the balancing authorities and they're sitting there saying, I did not realize this was a bid. You go out and do the bids and then the guys are, sitting there shuffling it back and forth and go, we're going to pay you to remain online.
Hmm.
And those power companies are all independent, depending on who owns them and everything else. This is a mind-boggling thing
Oh
for
yeah.
a power grid. My head exploded when I was trying to do some of that stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's very, very complicated. And, it becomes more challenging going forward because we are changing the generation mix,
Right,
like adding more wind and solar power, which, theoretically can be used in the same way as
right,
coal and gas if you have some storage capacity for times when production declines and you have the transmission capacity to move it around. Like maybe it's
right,
sunnier over here, but not sunnier over here, so you need to transport it. This just
right.
but it adds a real layer of complexity for these grid operators and making sure everything's in constant balance. And certainly, we're seeing that bear out in California. Just recently, we had to conserve power for like a
Oh
week
yeah,
because of the heat wave.
yeah.
And
Don't
so
don't charge your cars.
I don't envy the grid operators. Let me put it that way.
No. Did you ever see that Chevy Chase movie with I can't remember, Modern Problems? It's
I
the
don't know.
movies. The movie starts out and there's air traffic controllers that are just going bonkers. I mean, it was absolutely a disaster. And I can compare the grid operators to air traffic controllers. They got to
Yep.
take a shift and then shut down for several days.
Yep. Yep. There. Air traffic control is a good metaphor. But they got
Um,
they got a lot of planes in the air.
and the grid operators, oh my goodness. And everybody that's keeping the grid up, they're heroes. I mean, people don't realize how much work that they have to do.
A lot of work. Yep. A lot of work.
Um, and so when you take a look at some of the other stuff that you have that you're reporting on, what are you reporting on now that is different, that is going on in the grid and in California?
Well, I think that we're hitting on a lot of it, right? I mean, the energy transition is underway,
Right,
and certainly maintaining reliability in this sort of near-term transition is
right,
a challenge for various reasons, especially as we see, more extreme weather events, many of which
right,
can be exacerbated by climate change. Like the past is not the same predictor of the future as it
right,
once was, it seems, and so that relationship is breaking down. So how are these companies managing this risk? How are they reliability risk, safety risk, climate risk?
right,
At a time when we're becoming more reliant on electricity, whether it be to
right,
charge an EV or because you've phased out your gas stove or whatever it might be. So
right.
there's plenty of it's a really dynamic time in the space, and it's I tell you what, of course I know that people are interested in electricity because it's critical, but I think we're thinking about it differently than we used to because it's not as much of a given anymore that it's going to be there when we need it. So there's
That's
been a lot of
right.
interest in the book for this reason, and that's been nice to see that it can contribute to the conversation.
I hope your book just takes off totally because I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm gonna go give you a bazillion stars on it and everything else. But
Oh, thank you.
what do you think about the nukes and nuclear? Because I really think in order to get to net zero or whatever the term is, that we got to use nukes.
Yeah, a lot of people are of the same mind, especially because this is already steel in the ground. It's a carbon-free source of power. It's politically challenging, obviously, because there's a lot of people who are fearful of nuclear power.
Right,
In general, the U.S. nuclear industry has a very good track record in
right,
terms of safety, especially after Three Mile Island. So there's a lot of obviously, like in the California context, the last nuclear plant in the state was slated to start retire. It's a PG&E power plant. It was going to start
right,
closing down in 2024 and be offline by 2025. Now it's going to operate for the foreseeable future, at least another several years, most likely,
right,
as PG&E pursues relicensing because the state deemed it necessary to shore up supplies during this really challenging period of time. And there's other challenges too, supply chain issues. It's been harder to bring
oh
some of these
yeah,
clean energy projects online. it gets hotter throughout the West, making it harder to import power on an emergency basis. So
Right.
there's policymakers for different reasons are recognizing the necessity of having some of these
Right.
supplies, and we saw that clearly in California. Um, but elsewhere, it kind of remains to be seen what the political appetite is. And I think it's safe to say we're not going to be building more reactors at a huge scale. I mean, I
Right.
don't think we've ever really been able to do that on time and on budget. There's one underway in Georgia right now, and it's just the cost overruns are massive. So
Is that one been building for 10 years, I think?
yeah, and
I
it's
was
it's like it's so far over budget, but it's like history repeats itself because that was the same experience in like the
right.
in the 60s and
Uh,
70s, and so anyway, it'll be interesting to see what happens with that plan, and it'll be interesting to see what happens on a policy standpoint in terms of throwing lifelines to some of these other generators.
right.
So
You know, Kathrine, I was just reading a story yesterday, I think. I've slept, so it could have been a long time ago, but it was talking about, I think we have 200 coal plants, whatever the number is, that have been retired.
uh,
We have another 300 that are slated to be retired,
mhm,
but they would be good places for nuclear reactors if they
mhm,
were the smaller reactors.
yeah,
I love that idea. I mean, it seems to me that's where a lot of the cost overrun. And if you can build a micro reactor and bring that in, that seems to be a beautiful plan. I sure
sure.
hope it can come to that.
Yeah, that plan solves a lot of challenges, right? It's
Right.
sort of like what do you do with the plant, the leftover infrastructure? It already has
Right.
existing transmission connection, which is really big
Yeah.
because connecting to the grid is a real challenge right now with lots of people in line for approvals and upgrades and stuff like that. So it's
Oh,
not just,
yeah.
they're not just talking about setting small modular reactors in these plants, but also like large scale batteries to support renewables and like,
Right.
so it's like, how do you recycle the infrastructure, so to speak, and make use of the positive attributes that it has?
And,
So it does make sense. Yeah.
oh, I was really thrilled with that one. I just interviewed the CEO of a a thorium reactor company, and they're going to be able to build modular thorium, which uses nuclear waste. I was like, man, this is cool. And so they're going to be able to pump out one a day in like 4 more years or something like
Wow.
that. So Copenhagen Atomics. So that'll be a fun one. I would
That's
like to
cool.
see if we could get a manufacturing plant here in the U.S. That'd be kind of cool.
Yeah, that'd be neat.
So, but what is next for you, Kathrine, around the corner? Have you already started your next book?
They need a little bit of a break, but there's been a lot of requests for a Texas freeze book, so we'll see.
I think you would be great at it, and I know that your effort. And if anybody, both of my fans out there, I think your book should be bought by anybody trying to understand what's going on out there, because the grid is not just, plug it into the wall and it gets to your house.
Right.
There's some major issues going on.
Definitely.
And I really think you did a fabulous job getting all this information in there. So thank you for stopping by the
Thanks
podcast.
so much for having me. I'm so glad you thought so.
The-